No government right now can solve 38 trillion in debt and counting. We are past the Rubicon of an easy solution. A good leader would tell the truth about that. We wouldn't go to war. We wouldn't go into false promises. Central banks have been stacking over 1,000 tons a year since we weaponized the dollar in 2022. In other words, it's not just the gold camp anymore that sees this. And there's a reason why central banks hold more gold than US bonds or US treasuries. So it's not just the gold executives or the gold bugs, which we've been for decades, and I think we've been right for decades, that are admitting this.
One of the things you just mentioned is it seems complicated. Yes, there are a lot of very complex parts to this big system. However, I think one of the things that's the most baffling is because in our gut, in our hearts, in our fiber, in our core, in our human nature, we expect money to be true. And so everything we think about is assuming money is true. And whereas we're being told that lie, and we're not being told out loud, the important part is that no, money is a lie, money is shrinking, money is withering, money is fading, and therefore everything seems wrong, everything seems difficult, everything seems upside down, and nothing seems to make sense because we're thinking about it wrongly, out of our own innocence, our own good-natured innocence and naivety, assuming that we live in a benign society. We're not being conned by our own elected leaders. So
that's the saddest part of all, because I think I've always said the government isn't your friend. That sounds very anti-patriotic, very cynical, very gold buggy, sensational. I get that. I'm a patriot. You're a patriot. We all love our country. I think there are good politicians. There are good people in D.C. I just think they're a minority. It goes to our original point. It's something Egon knew decades ago, something that's harder to quantify, harder to articulate, is trust. And how do you measure the decline in trust? And how do you if you see that problem with the lie of the currency, then it's easier to see the solution. But you don't see that problem if you trust. And people who trust aren't stupid. They're not naive. They're usually very good people. They would never openly lie about a currency the way our governments do, or manipulate data, whether it's the BLS on inflation or constantly downgraded labor reports. They would not do that in their family, in their business, or with their friends. And because they're good, decent people who don't have PhDs or congressional budgets, they just assume the experts are to be trusted, because many times they could be. But the island of misfit toys that comprises our Congress and Senate today isn't, to me, our best and brightest. We've come a long way from John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, or Thomas Paine, or Alexander Hamilton, or Eisenhower or Truman, who believed in balanced budgets. We're a long way from those type of figures, whether you like them or not. We don't have the type of leadership we did, but that trust in that system, and therefore that money, is sad, because you are being manipulated and discredited and lied to. And that's a strong statement. But if you look at the math and look at the history, especially since Nixon in 71, the evidence is fairly compelling. But I don't think people who don't want to hear that are bad people. They're usually very good people. That's the saddest of all. I know in Spain there are signs on the highway, don't pull over to help people with a flat tire, because many times you're being robbed when you stop to help someone with a flat tire. In other words, these thieves are taking advantage of your goodness to rob you. I'm not saying that's every politician and every government, but when you lie about inflation and you lie about sound money and you go off a gold-backed standard and you say that that's not going to be inflationary and that your dollar will be just as worth as much tomorrow as it was today, as Nixon promised, that was as much of a lie as someone robbing you on the highway in Spain. In other words, they're taking advantage of your trust to pull the wool over your eyes. And that's been going on for 5 decades now. And we're just seeing the culmination of that now. That is, again, why gold is at record highs, why it's being stacked by central banks at record levels, and why even commercial banks recommend it more than U.S. Treasuries. The evidence is overwhelming. Don't feel like you're stupid or you missed out just because you don't have gold yet. You can still get some, and you can still get some silver. Just be careful with it. And don't just do that because I, as a gold executive in Switzerland, or Egon in Switzerland, or anyone else selling this, those of us that have been in this business for decades actually believe with high conviction that we're doing you a favor to recommend an allocation to gold. Whether you're our client or not is irrelevant. If you can afford some and you could hold it for a long time, it will hold its value better than that paper dollar in your wallet, which is just a Federal Reserve note, a piece of credit, an IOU backed by nothing. It's very sad. I understand the trust in the government, left or right. I understand it. I still believe in our country. I still believe in a good government someday. But no government right now can solve 38 trillion in debt and counting. We are past the Rubicon of an easy solution. A good leader would tell the truth about that. We wouldn't go to war. We wouldn't go into false promises. We'd, like a good family and a good father or a good mother, would sit down with the kids, or like a good board of governors, a good corporation board. We'd talk about our balance sheet more honestly with each other, and we go through it together. We can't go through that together if we don't talk honestly about the problem.
Our response to gold has been shaped by 40 years of benign economic climate, with lower real interest rates, negative real interest rates, frankly, and moderated inflation. I suggest that 40 years is over. Gold does well when people, as we've discussed before, are concerned about the maintenance of their purchasing power and other savings and investment assets. And people should be very concerned. I consider the quote in US dollar terms to be a floating abstraction, because despite the fact that it's the worldwide medium of exchange, the US dollar is a floating abstraction. I also note that against most currencies, gold is already in record territory. I think that if your listeners believe that we will return to real interest rates, which is to say that inflation will subside below the rate paid on the US 10-year Treasury, that they don't need to own gold. I suspect that if your listeners believe what Justin Trudeau said, which is the budget will balance itself, that they don't need to own gold. I suggest that if your listeners believe that $32 trillion in on-balance sheet liabilities and $100 trillion in off-balance sheet liabilities being serviced by a budget in deficit as to $2 trillion a year is something that they don't need to be concerned about, they shouldn't own gold. I don't share a lack of concern about any of that. I think inflation is a problem. I think negative real interest rates, particularly as a saver, is a problem. I think the debt is a problem. I think the deficit is obscene. The consequence of that is that I own physical gold, a fair amount of it. How do we get out of this circumstance? There's only two ways that I can think of. You change the nature of your payments, which is to say you means test Social Security, you reduce the benefit, you change the year that people accrue it, which will wreak real hardship in the U.S. economy. And likely, you inflate away the net present value of the obligation. What the United States did in the decade of the 1970s is via inflation, they inflated away 85% of the net present value of their obligations. They devalued the US dollar in terms of purchasing power by 85% over 10 years. That coincided with an increase in the gold price from $35 an ounce, admittedly price controlled, to $850 an ounce. What I'm telling you in a very long-winded fashion is that if past is prologue, the US government will have to do again to the purchasing power of the dollar what they did in the decade of the 1970s. And it is likely to me that the financial asset that people will turn to as a consequence of the deterioration of their purchasing power in US dollar savings will be gold.
First question's from Jerry. Do you think the gold/silver bull run is done after the price collapse this week, or do you advise to hold on to gold and gold miners? I appreciate it's difficult to call a top in the market, but what are your thoughts on it when we might be time for us to go back into fiat? Thank you. For me, determining whether gold has topped is primarily a function of just two questions. Number one, is the U.S. willing to let China make more and more of its weapons for us and eventually make all of the weapons for the U.S. military? Question number two, will China and Russia elect or otherwise institute Yeltsin-like leaders who are willing to sell off their country's assets to American interests for pennies on the dollar and then turn their nations into full-on U.S. economic vassals willing to buy infinite amounts of treasuries with surpluses at negative real rates, and thereby allowing the U.S. to expropriate the wealth of those countries fully in order to support Washington largesse and U.S. defense payments and U.S. entitlements payments. If the answer to either of those questions is no, then the top in gold is not in. That's how I'm thinking about it with my own money. From CT.
This is $10,000. It's 100 $100 bills, tightly stacked and wrapped. All the money in this video will be made up of these $10,000 bricks. This is $100,000. 10 stacks of $10,000. This is $1 million. Life-changing money for most, it's 100 of these $10,000 bricks. Next, $10 million. Enough to live very comfortably if you're careful. However, some people have won more than this in the lottery and have managed to recklessly lose it all. 100 million. People have won this in the lottery as well, and have also managed to lose all of it. Imagine that. This is not the national debt. This is $1 billion. It's made up of 100,000 of those $10,000 bricks, and it weighs about 11 tons. So far in these visualizations, I've gone up by factors of 10. 10,000, 100,000, 1 million, etc. This next one is a bit different. Can you guess how much this is? If you guessed $1 trillion, or even the national debt, those are both perfectly good guesses, wrong, but good. This is $500 billion, or 500 billion. It's a loose pile 63 feet tall, weighing over 5,500 tons. If you made $10,000 per second, it would take nearly a year and 7 months to make 500 billion. But this isn't the national debt. The US national debt is $37 trillion. You need 74 of these piles to make up the national debt. Like this. This is the national debt. It weighs a lot, both physically and metaphorically. Every 50 days, add another 500 billion. It grows by 1 trillion every 100 days. Now, I can point out a lot of statistics and fun facts, but really it's just completely unsustainable. The GDP of the United States is only $29.4 trillion. Our debt is higher than our GDP. The IRS collects about $5 trillion in taxes every year, $1 trillion of which goes to pay off just the interest on the national debt. That's 20%. 20% of your taxes go to pay interest on this debt. It is not sustainable. This small pile here is a real-time one-to-one representation of how quickly the national debt grows. The national debt grows at a rate of $48,100 per second. And since the start of this video has grown by $10 million. It would take some sort of miracle to fix all this. Or perhaps just one well thought out plan. Hold your breath. Make a wish. Count to 3.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States. Now, what does this action, which is very technical, what does it mean for you? Let me lay to rest the bugaboo of what is called devaluation. If you want to buy a foreign car or take a trip abroad, market conditions may cause your dollar to buy slightly less. But if you are among the overwhelming majority of Americans who buy American-made products in America, your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today. The effect of this action, in other words, will be to stabilize the dollar.